The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Flagstaff, Arizona, as Sarah Martinez clutched the foreclosure notice with trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, each word a dagger twisting deeper into her chest. Final notice glared at her in bold red letters, a cruel reminder that she had 30 days to come up with $43,000, money she didn't have, money that her late husband David had borrowed without her knowledge. 3 months. It had been 3 months since David's sudden heart attack had left her not just widowed, but drowning in a sea of debt she never knew existed. The small ranch house on the outskirts of town, the one they'd called home for 8 years, now felt like a prison with walls closing in. Sarah's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, jolting her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she'd grown to dread: Pinnacle Collections. Her stomach twisted as she let it ring, knowing that ignoring it would only make tomorrow's call more aggressive. The voicemail that followed was predictably harsh, Marcus Webb's gravelly voice promising serious consequences if she didn't return his call within 24 hours. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves as Sarah stepped onto her front porch, desperate for fresh air to clear the suffocating weight in her chest. The small garden David had helped her plant last spring was withering, much like everything else in her life. She'd stopped watering it weeks ago, unable to muster the energy for anything beyond the basic motions of survival. A black sedan pulled into her driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon light like dark mirrors. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the car. It belonged to Webb's enforcement team. 2 men in cheap suits stepped out, their faces wearing the practiced expressions of people who'd perfected the art of intimidation. "Mrs. Martinez," the taller one called out, his voice carrying a false politeness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "We need to have a conversation about your husband's obligations." Sarah's hands instinctively moved to her arms, wrapping around herself as if she could somehow shield her heart from what was coming. "I've told you before, I don't have the money. David never told me about any of this. Your husband signed contracts, Mom. Legal documents. The debt doesn't disappear just because he did." The shorter man pulled out a thick manila folder, flipping through pages with theatrical precision. 43,000 plus interest, plus our collection fees. The wind picked up, scattering dried leaves across the yard like confetti at a funeral. Sarah watched them dance in the air, wishing she could disappear just as easily. "Please, I'm trying to find work. I just need more time." "Time isn't something we have a lot of, Mrs. Martinez." The tall man stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face. "Your husband borrowed money from serious people who don't accept 'I need more time' as payment." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was something different about today's visit, something darker in their tone. These weren't just collectors anymore. They were threats given human form. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that our patience has limits." The man's smile was razor thin. "And you're about to find out what happens when those limits are reached." As their car pulled away, leaving nothing but dust and dread in its wake, Sarah sank onto her porch steps. The weight of isolation pressed down on her like a physical thing. No family nearby, no close friends who could help with this kind of money, no safety net to catch her fall. David's life insurance had barely covered the funeral expenses, and her part-time job at the local diner brought in just enough to cover groceries and utilities. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Instead, each fading ray of light felt like another step toward an inevitable darkness. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and went inside, double-checking the locks on both the front and back doors. A habit she'd developed since David's death, though she wasn't sure what she was trying to keep out anymore. The house felt too quiet, too empty, David's coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, and his work boots remained by the back door where he'd left them that final morning. She'd meant to put them away dozens of times, but somehow they'd become anchors to a life that felt increasingly like a dream. As night fell over Flagstaff, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, trying to perform the same impossible math she'd attempted every night for weeks. No matter how she arranged the numbers, they never added up to hope. The mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks, the electricity bill was overdue, and now Webb's people were escalating their threats. She thought about her sister in Phoenix, wondering if pride was worth more than safety. But even if she swallowed her pride and called, what could she say? That the man everyone thought was a responsible husband and father had secretly gambled away their future? That she'd been living a lie for years without even knowing it? The phone rang again, cutting through the silence like a blade. This time it wasn't the collection agency, it was an unknown number, which somehow felt even more ominous. Sarah let it go to voicemail, her hands shaking as she waited for the message. Mrs. Martinez, this is Jake Morrison from the bank. I'm calling about your mortgage. We need to discuss your options before we proceed with foreclosure proceedings. Please call me first thing Monday morning. Options. The word felt hollow, like a promise someone had no intention of keeping. Sarah turned off the lights and headed to bed, knowing that sleep would be as elusive as the money she needed to save her home. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of a train horn echoing across the vast Arizona landscape. Somewhere in that darkness, forces were already in motion, forces that would soon change everything about Sarah's carefully constructed world of quiet desperation. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah refilled coffee cups with mechanical precision, her smile as artificial as the sweetener packets scattered across the counter. 3 days had passed since Webb's men had made their veiled threats, and every customer who walked through the door made her stomach clench with anticipation. The morning rush was winding down, leaving only a few regulars nursing their coffee and reading newspapers that carried news of a world that seemed increasingly distant from her own problems. "You all right, honey?" Martha, the head waitress, appeared beside her with a concerned expression. At 62, Martha had seen enough heartbreak to recognize it in others. "You've been jumpier than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Sarah forced another smile, this one slightly more genuine. "Just tired, I guess? Haven't been sleeping well?" "Grief'll do that to you." Martha's weathered hand found Sarah's shoulder. "Takes time to find your footing again. David was a good man." If only you knew, Sarah thought, but she simply nodded and continued her rounds. The truth about David's debts felt like a betrayal she couldn't share, even with someone as kind as Martha. It would taint everyone's memories of him, and right now, those memories were all she had left of the man she'd thought she'd married. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a man she didn't recognize sliding into a corner booth. He was tall and lean, with weathered hands and dark hair that caught the light in a way that suggested it had been touched by both sun and wind. His clothing was simple, jeans, a flannel shirt, and work boots that had seen better days, but there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention without demanding it. Most notably, he was quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone who didn't know what to say, but the purposeful quiet of someone who understood the value of listening. When Sarah approached with her coffee pot, he simply nodded toward his cup, his dark eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the window. "You're new around here," Sarah said, not sure why she felt compelled to break the silence. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "Coffee's good." Something about his presence was oddly comforting, like a steady campfire in a world full of flickering shadows. Sarah found herself lingering at his table longer than necessary, refilling his cup twice before he'd even drunk half of it. "You seem troubled," he said quietly, not looking at her directly but somehow seeing everything. Sarah's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "I'm fine." "No," he said with gentle certainty, "you're not." Before she could respond, the diner door burst open with such force that the bell above it swung wildly. Marcus Webb strutted in like he owned the place, his expensive suit looking out of place among the worn vinyl booths and checkered floors. Behind him came his two enforcers, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere of the room. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Webb had never come to her workplace before, and his appearance here felt like a violation of the last safe space she had left. Every customer in the diner seemed to sense the change, conversations dropping to whispers as they watched the scene unfold. "Mrs. Martinez," Webb's voice carried across the room like a snake's hiss. "We need to talk." "I'm working," Sarah replied, her voice barely steady. "Not anymore." Webb nodded to one of his men, who walked over to Martha. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to give Mrs. Martinez a few minutes. Business matter." Martha's eyes flashed with protective fury. "This is a place of business, not your personal office. You want to talk to Sarah, you can wait until she's off shift." Webb's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I don't think you understand the situation, ma'am. This is a matter of some urgency." Sarah watched the scene unfold with growing horror. Webb was escalating, bringing her problems into the one place where she'd felt some measure of normalcy. The shame burned in her chest like acid, and she could feel the eyes of every customer in the diner weighing her down. "It's okay, Martha," Sarah said quietly. "I'll handle it." But as she walked toward Webb's table, she felt a gentle hand on her arm. The quiet man from the corner booth had moved so silently that she hadn't noticed him getting up. He was now standing between her and Webb, his presence somehow filling the space despite his unassuming demeanor. "The lady said she's working," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Webb's enforcers shift uncomfortably. Webb looked the stranger up and down, clearly trying to assess whether this was a threat worth taking seriously. "This doesn't concern you, friend. I suggest you mind your own business." "Her peace is my business now," the man replied, and something in his tone made the hair on Sarah's arm stand up. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Webb's voice carried a mocking edge, but Sarah noticed his enforcers were no longer looking relaxed. "Someone who thinks a woman should be able to work without being harassed." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other diners were quietly reaching for their phones, and Sarah could see Martha moving toward the kitchen, probably to call the police. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Sarah knew she had to act before someone got hurt. "Please," she said, stepping forward, "I'll talk to you, Mr. Webb, but not here. Not in front of everyone." Webb's cold eyes moved between Sarah and the stranger, calculating odds and consequences. Finally, he straightened his tie and smiled his reptilian smile. "Fine. But understand, Mrs. Martinez, our patience is wearing thin. You have until Friday to produce our money, or we'll be forced to explore other collection methods." The threat hung in the air like smoke as Webb and his men filed out of the diner. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft murmur of customers trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Sarah felt her knees threatening to buckle, but the stranger's steady presence beside her kept her upright. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "Name's Thomas Begay." The name struck a chord of recognition. Begay was a common Navajo surname, and now she could place the slight accent she'd noticed earlier. "I'm Sarah Martinez." "I know." Thomas's dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw something she'd almost forgotten existed: genuine concern from someone who expected nothing in return. "You're in trouble." It wasn't a question, and Sarah found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "More than you know." "Then maybe it's time you weren't alone with it." The simple statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been carrying the weight of David's deceptions, the debt, the threats, and the shame all by herself for months. The idea that someone, a stranger, might actually want to help felt too dangerous to believe. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "This isn't just about money. These aren't just debt collectors. There's something else, something worse." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he'd suspected as much. "I've known men like Webb before. They start with papers and legal threats, but they always end up in darker places." "Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the mountains that ringed Flagstaff like sleeping giants. "Sometimes the spirits put us where we need to be," he said finally. "And sometimes people who've been broken understand what it means to help hold someone else together." As Sarah looked into his eyes, she saw something she recognized: pain that had been transformed into strength, scars that had become wisdom. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the San Francisco peaks, and the wind carried the scent of rain and change. Sarah didn't know yet that Thomas Begay carried his own history with men like Webb, or that his quiet strength had been forged in fires that would have destroyed weaker souls. All she knew was that for the first time since David's death, she wasn't facing the darkness alone. The rain arrived that evening like a benediction, washing the dust from the streets of Flagstaff and turning the air clean and sharp. Sarah sat on her porch, watching the water cascade from the gutters, while Thomas worked quietly in her front yard, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he reinforced the loose fence that had been another casualty of her neglect. He'd appeared at her door 2 hours after the incident at the diner, carrying a toolbox and wearing an expression that brooked no argument. "Security," he'd said simply, and something in his tone had made her step aside and let him work. "You don't have to do this," Sarah called out, raising her voice over the sound of rain on the metal roof. Thomas paused in his work, looking up at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Yes, I do." The certainty in his voice made her chest tighten. She'd grown so accustomed to being alone with her problems that having someone actually choose to help felt almost surreal. "I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." He returned to his work, driving stakes into the ground with measured blows that spoke of years of hard labor. Sarah wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and watched him work. There was something hypnotic about his movements, a rhythm that spoke of a man who understood the value of doing things right the first time. When he finally finished and joined her on the porch, shaking the rain from his dark hair, she felt compelled to break the comfortable silence. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas settled into the chair beside her, his presence filling the space without overwhelming it. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain drumming against the roof and the distant rumble of thunder over the mountains. "Had a wife once," he said finally, his voice quiet enough that she had to lean forward to hear him. "Emily. She was Anglo, like you. Met her when I was working construction in Phoenix." Sarah waited, sensing that this was a story he didn't tell often. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer." The words came out flat, devoid of emotion, but Sarah could hear the pain underneath. Before that, though, she went through something similar to what you're facing. Her first husband left her with debts she didn't know about, collection agencies, threats, the whole nightmare. "What happened?" Thomas's laugh was bitter. "She handled it alone." Took 2 jobs, sold everything she owned, worked herself into the ground trying to pay off money she never spent. By the time I met her, she was so used to fighting by herself that she almost couldn't let anyone help. The rain was slowing now, turning from a downpour to a gentle patter that made the desert air smell like sage and possibility. Sarah found herself drawn into Thomas's story, recognizing pieces of her own experience in his words. "It took me 2 years to convince her she didn't have to carry everything by herself," he continued. 2 years of showing up, of being there when she needed someone, of proving that not everyone was going to disappear when things got difficult. And then she got sick? Yeah. Thomas's hands moved to his lap, fingers intertwining in a gesture that spoke of old grief. Fought that alone too at first. Old habits die hard. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding now why this quiet man had stepped between her and Webb's threats. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be smart." Thomas turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You're making the same mistake she did, thinking you have to handle everything alone, thinking you don't deserve help." "I don't know you," Sarah said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "You know enough." Thomas stood, moving to the porch railing where he could look out over the rain-washed landscape. "You know I helped you today when I didn't have to. You know I'm here fixing your fence when I could be anywhere else. You know I'm not asking for anything in return." Sarah's throat felt tight. "But why? What do you get out of it?" "Peace," Thomas said simply. "Emily died believing she was a burden, believing she had to face everything alone. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can help you understand what she never did, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else share the weight." The rain had stopped now, leaving the world clean and glistening. Sarah could smell the wet earth and the pine trees, scents that reminded her of better times when David had been alive, and her biggest worry was whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in the garden. "The debt," she said quietly. "It's not just the money. Webb isn't just a collector. The men who lent David the money, they're not the kind of people who write off bad debts." Thomas nodded as if he'd suspected as much. "How much?" 43,000, plus interest, plus collection fees." The numbers felt like stones in her mouth. David was gambling, online poker, sports betting, things I never knew about. He was good at hiding it until he wasn't. And now Webb's people are escalating. "They came to my work today." "They've never done that before." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I think they're done with patience." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Sarah look at him more carefully. "I've dealt with men like Webb before. They always follow the same pattern, start with legal threats, then move to personal intimidation. Then..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "How do you know so much about people like him?" Thomas's smile was grim. "Because I used to be one of them." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at him, trying to reconcile the gentle man who'd fixed her fence with the image of someone who worked for debt collectors. "Not Webb," Thomas said quickly, reading her expression, "but people like him. After I got out of the army, I needed work. Construction wasn't steady and I had bills to pay. A man offered me a job doing collections, said I had the right look for it." The right look? Intimidating, quiet, someone who could make people pay attention without having to raise his voice. Thomas's expression was haunted. "I was good at it. Too good." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. "What changed?" "I met Emily." Thomas's voice softened. "She was working as a nurse at the hospital where I took someone who'd had a heart attack after I'd visited him. She looked at me like I was something that had crawled out from under a rock. Was she right? Yeah. Thomas's honesty was brutal. She was. I'd convinced myself I was just doing a job, but the truth was, I was hurting people who were already hurt. Taking what little hope they had left and crushing it. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Sarah felt her understanding of Thomas shift, seeing him now as someone who'd walked in darkness and found his way back to the light. So you quit? Not immediately, but Emily, she had a way of making you see yourself clearly. She never lectured me, never told me I was wrong. She just asked questions, made me think about what I was doing to people who were already drowning. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Sarah realized the storm was moving east toward the reservation lands where many of the Navajo people lived. She thought about Thomas's last name, about the cultural weight of community and responsibility that his people carried. Your family, what did they think about your work? Thomas's expression grew even more somber. My grandmother wouldn't speak to me for 2 years. In Navajo tradition, we believe in Hoshu, living in balance with the world around us. What I was doing was the opposite of that. I was creating suffering instead of healing. And now you're trying to balance the scales? Something like that. Thomas looked at her directly again, and Sarah saw a depth of understanding in his eyes that took her breath away. I know what it's like to be on both sides of this, Sarah. I know how Webb's people think, how they operate, what they're willing to do to get their money. Are you saying you can help me? I'm saying I can try. Thomas's voice was steady, but Sarah caught the underlying current of determination. But you have to let me. No more carrying this alone. No more thinking you don't deserve help. As Sarah looked at this man who'd walked out of the rain and into her life, she felt something shift inside her chest. The weight of her problems hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, she wasn't carrying it alone. Outside, the storm was passing, leaving behind air that smelled of hope and new beginnings. Okay, she said quietly. What do we do? Thomas's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. We start by making sure you're safe. Then we figure out how to make this right. As they sat together on the porch, watching the last of the rain clouds disappear over the mountains, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. She didn't know yet what Thomas's plan would entail, or what prices they'd both have to pay for taking on men like Webb. All she knew was that she was no longer alone in the darkness, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. The confrontation came 3 days later, just as Thomas had predicted it would. Sarah was walking to her car after her shift at the diner when she saw the black sedan parked across the street, its engine running, and its occupants watching her with the patient intensity of predators. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled with her keys, but before she could reach her car, 2 of Webb's men stepped out of the shadows. Mrs. Martinez, the taller one called out, his voice carrying the same false politeness that had become so familiar. Mr. Webb would like a word. Sarah's throat felt dry as sandpaper. I'm going home. Not yet, you're not. The shorter man moved to block her path to the car. You've been avoiding our calls. That's not very neighborly. Before Sarah could respond, she heard the soft crunch of gravel behind her. Thomas appeared at her shoulder, his presence as quiet and sudden as always, but somehow filling the space between her and the 2 men. Problem here? Thomas asked, his voice carrying the same deceptive calm she'd heard in the diner. The taller man's eyes narrowed as he recognized Thomas from their previous encounter. This is private business, Chief. Walk away. The racial slur hit the air like a slap, and Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "The lady's safety is my business, and she's going home now." "I don't think so." The shorter man reached inside his jacket, and Sarah's blood turned to ice as she saw the bulge of a shoulder holster. "Mr. Webb doesn't like to be kept waiting." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left Sarah breathless. Thomas moved with fluid precision, his hand shooting out to grab the shorter man's wrist before he could draw his weapon. There was a brief struggle, a muffled curse, and then the man was on the ground, his arm twisted at an angle that made him gasp in pain. "You're going to leave now," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made both men take a step back. "And you're going to tell Webb that if he wants to talk to Mrs. Martinez, he can do it through proper legal channels." The taller man helped his companion to his feet, both of them looking at Thomas with a mixture of respect and wariness. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Thomas replied, and something in his tone made even Sarah believe him. As the men retreated to their car, Thomas turned to Sarah with concern written across his features. "Are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head, though her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold her keys. "How did you know they'd be here?" "I've been watching." Thomas's admission should have been unsettling, but instead it felt like a blanket of protection. "Men like Webb always escalate when they feel they're losing control. I wanted to make sure you were safe." "That man had a gun." "Yeah." Thomas's expression was grim, "which means we're running out of time to do this the easy way." They drove to Sarah's house in Thomas's pickup truck, leaving her car in the diner parking lot where it would be safer. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and the adrenaline aftermath of confrontation. "You said you had a plan," Sarah said as they pulled into her driveway. "What kind of plan?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he stared at her small house. "The kind that requires you to trust me completely, and the kind that might put both of us in danger." "More danger than I'm already in?" "Different kind of danger." Thomas turned to look at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "I know where Webb keeps his records. I know how he operates, who he works for, and what he's afraid of." "You're talking about breaking the law." "I'm talking about survival." Thomas's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the underlying current of determination. "Webb's people aren't going to stop. They can't afford to let word get out that they can be ignored. Eventually, they're going to do something that can't be undone." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we take away their leverage." Thomas's smile was grim. "Webb's entire operation depends on fear and secrecy. But if the right people knew what he was really doing, if they had proof of his methods, you want to expose him. I want to end him." The words came out flat and final, but not the way I used to, not through violence or intimidation, through the truth. As they sat together in the darkening truck, Sarah felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. She could refuse, could try to handle this through legal channels that she couldn't afford and that might not protect her anyway. Or she could trust this quiet man who'd walked into her life and chosen to fight for her when no one else would. "What would you need me to do?" Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Be brave. One more time." That night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to the desert wind whisper through the pine trees, she thought about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been a relatively happy wife, living what she'd thought was a normal life. Now she was a widow, planning to take on dangerous men, with the help of a former debt collector who'd found redemption in helping others. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas had once been part of the system that was now crushing her, but his experience on the other side made him uniquely qualified to fight it. He understood the weaknesses, the pressure points, the places where men like Webb were most vulnerable. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the San Francisco peaks standing sharp against a sky the color of turquoise. Sarah arrived at the diner to find Thomas already waiting in his usual corner booth, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, and a manila envelope resting on the table. "Records," he said simply as she approached. "Webb's operation, his clients, his methods, everything." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. "How did you get this?" "I still have friends in places I used to work." Thomas's voice was carefully neutral. "People who remember what it was like before Webb took over. People who've been waiting for someone to stand up to him. And if he finds out, he won't." Thomas's confidence was absolute. "Not until it's too late." Sarah opened the envelope and felt her breath catch. Inside were photographs, financial records, recorded conversations, and documentation of threats and intimidation tactics that went far beyond simple debt collection. This wasn't just evidence of harassment, it was proof of criminal conspiracy. "This is..." she began, but Thomas held up a hand. "This is justice," he said quietly. "For you, for Emily, for everyone who's been hurt by men like Webb." As Sarah studied the documents, she felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, but it was being replaced by something stronger: anger. Righteous anger at the system that had allowed David to destroy their lives, at the men who'd profited from her suffering, at the silence that had protected predators like Webb for far too long. "What happens now?" Thomas's smile was the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him. "Now we make some phone calls. FBI, State Attorney General, IRS. Turns out Webb's been very sloppy about reporting his income." That afternoon, Sarah stood in her small kitchen, watching through the window as Thomas made call after call from his truck. She could see him talking, gesturing, occasionally nodding as he spoke to people she couldn't see. Each conversation was another nail in Webb's coffin, another step toward the kind of justice that couldn't be bought or intimidated. When he finally came inside, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "It's done. Federal agents will be executing warrants on Webb's offices tomorrow morning. By the time they're finished, he'll be too busy defending himself to worry about collecting debts." Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief. "And the money, the debt. Illegal contracts aren't enforceable." Thomas's smile was gentle. "Once the authorities finish their investigation, you'll probably find out you never owed anything to begin with." As the sun set over Flagstaff that evening, Sarah and Thomas sat together on her porch, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. The danger wasn't completely over. There would be depositions, court appearances, and the long process of legal resolution. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Emily would have liked you," he said finally. "She always said the strongest people were the ones who learned to ask for help. Is that what I did?" "No." Thomas's voice was warm with affection. "You did something harder. You learned to accept it." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Sarah realized that somewhere in the midst of fighting for her survival, she'd found something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. Not just for tomorrow, but for the possibility that people could be better than their worst moments, that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Thomas had shown her that sometimes the most broken people were the ones best equipped to help others heal. He'd taken the darkness of his past and transformed it into light for someone else, proving that redemption wasn't just possible, it was the most powerful force in the world. 2 weeks later, the morning news carried the story of Marcus Webb's arrest on federal charges of racketeering, extortion, and mail fraud. Sarah watched the coverage from her kitchen, sipping coffee from David's old mug and feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Thomas had left the day before, called away by family obligations on the reservation, but his presence lingered in the repaired fence, in the sense of safety that now filled her home, and in the quiet confidence that had replaced the fear in her heart. He'd saved her, but more importantly, he taught her to save herself. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most profound healing came not from forgetting the past, but from finding the courage to face it with someone who understood what it meant to be broken and still choose to stand up again. The desert wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of new beginnings. Sarah smiled, finished her coffee, and went outside to tend the garden she'd finally found the strength to replant.